The next day, John was there again with 2 of his disciples. When he saw Jesus passing by, he said, "Look, the Lamb of God." When the 2 disciples heard him say this, they followed Jesus. Turning around, Jesus saw them following and asked, "What do you want?" They said, "Rabbi, where are you staying?" "Come," he replied, "and you will see." So they went and saw where he was staying, and they spent that day with him. Over the past 2 to 3 years, I have found my head turned and my heart caught by the transformative glimpse of God I have experienced through Christian community. Like the 2 disciples, I have felt this glimpse feed a deeper curiosity, prompting me to follow and ultimately be invited to come and see. To this end, this 2023, I am embarking on a 6-month journey to dwell with various Christian communities. On the way, I'll be sharing interviews with community members, founders, and leaders to learn more about the blessings, challenges, and wisdom these dwelling places of God hold. In doing so, I hope to inform how it is we might nurture people and communities to be transformative manifestations of God, offering a glimpse of the divine and inviting people to come and see God's loving dwelling place.
Your lovely dwelling place, in you my living God.
Maybe do you want to give a little summary of places? Like what were some places that you? What were some of the I don't know, highlights, or like what were the outlier? I think like what surprised you on your like?
I don't know whether it'd be useful to like summarise the different types of community that I visited. So like the categories which emerged. So in visiting different communities, I hadn't categorised them in my head like this before actually visiting them, but in my head I've now classified them. In that there are kind of your rural retreat centres, so places like Iona, which you may have heard of, Scargill, and so Christian centres often in very rural places which offer just a space of restoration and retreats for people. And they're often, well, they're so isolated they just like have to live like very isolated and their whole life is community. And they're often more transient. They're not places that people live there for like years on end. Iona people, like employment is just for 3 years. People just tend to stay for a volunteer season. Scargill, there's actually a cap on 6 years. You're not meant to stay there longer than 6 years. And the community helps operate the retreat centre. So they're not paid as such, but they're stipended. But there's like an in and out of mostly kind of gap year aged people, and then early retired is like the main demographic, and occasionally families. So that's one model. They're usually quite established and financially quite viable. They've got their whole economic model is the community runs a retreat centre, people pay to go to these retreats, and that funds the community. And I think places like Iona, Scargill, the Abbey have been going on for years and are very anchored in that model. And then urban communities, which really, I think that's probably the communities which surprised me the most, because I identify as more of an outdoor person. I was actually quite worried about being in Birmingham for a week. I was like, oh my God, surviving.
We've all been worried about that.
But really touched by like 2 community houses linked to a Church of England congregation, and they're just really rooted in the local area, and their community houses have been just used to house whoever like needs somewhere to be. So in the past that has been asylum seekers. When I was there was someone who was currently unemployed but starting up a charity, and so in that in-between time of like no formal employment but starting a charity was able to live there. And one of the community member who's been there the longest is a vicar but suffers from chronic fatigue, and so it enabled her to be somewhere where she can afford the rent because it's lower, not have to work traditional 9 to 5, but still be ministering to the local area and using her kind of skills as a vicar and her heart for people. And then Love Bristol, which Gwyneth oversees, and so like a huge network of Christian communities in an urban context and ministering to the local area, just being present in that local area in a very powerful way. And that was really touching for me to see. And there's an urban community in Durham also linked to a church. So it often feels like the urban communities tend to be linked to a church, which is interesting. And I'm interested in that model of community for the sake of the church as well. Because you've got communities who arise as kind of like not a rebellion, but kind of feeling like church is not enough, which I can understand. But there's also, for me personally, a desire to link community life and church and how they can nurture and feed each other. Trying to think where the other categories. You've got the more new monastic ones, or ones which are, they're essentially new monastic orders. So they're not your traditional like Benedictine, Franciscan, blah blah blah, but still take lifelong vows. So I visited Madonna House from Hoods Bay, which is Catholic, and they take vows of poverty, chastity and obedience. Or you've got Chemin Neuf, which is Catholic, charismatic and ecumenical, and once again people have the option of taking lifelong vows. And then the Broodhof take lifelong vows, and they're the ones where you're allowed to age in them. But in the communities where you're not allowed to age in them are the ones where you don't take lifelong vows. Which brings me on to the final category, I think, which is I call them places of belonging, so places like Pilsden and Winter Hill Wood, which tend to be Christian in foundation, but not members don't have to be Christian to be a part of them. And they're places for people, they use language of people in crisis, so that could be people who are kind of in severe grief, recovering from addiction, people with psychiatric issues, sometimes people with learning disability as well. And visiting those places, it's people who've fallen through the cracks of society, and these places being a place where they can actually be and be celebrated. And at Pilsden, people have stayed there many years. So one of the members has been there 40 years, and one of the members is also like over 80. So you don't have to be fit and working to be a part of them. So that's probably the model of community which my heart is also very attached to, is that these very open spaces of belonging. And they often have an agricultural component where they work the land, and kind of ecotherapy component for them, I guess. So those are like...
Would that be part of the economic model? Would that sustain them?
Yeah, so those ones, I think there's you have to pay to be a part of them, so I think the idea is that benefits help sustain that community. Pilsden are very well supported by donors, but people pay to stay there, and that comes out of their benefits. I think Winter Hill Wood is also benefits or private means, and the land component means they can grow up their own food, and they both only eat their own meat, which I think is really cool. But it's not what economically sustains them.
Right.
Yeah.
And can I ask, you said, maybe if I heard this right, you were living in Cambridge in community before you went on this journey of discovery. What was the context in which you were living then?
Yeah, so the community is called Lynn's House, and I don't know whether you've heard of L'Arche, but L'Arche, communities for people with and without learning disabilities. So it's inspired by L'Arche. Lynn's House, we don't live alongside people with learning disabilities, but we exist as a place of friendship for both people with and without learning disabilities. So during university term time there are regular evening meals where people get together, and we also have monthly tea parties which Jen assisted, and it's just a place of friendship. Often people with learning disabilities, they're actually very well provisioned for in Cambridge. There are various day centres and things, but they lean towards like only people with learning disabilities. It's not necessarily kind of friendship for the sake of friendship or natural friendship. And so Lynn's House is a place where they come without their carers, without parents. It's like an explicitly no carer, no parent zone. And it's about it very much has a spirituality of giving and receiving across lines of ability, and being specific to the Cambridge context of people feel so defined by their intellectual capabilities. And so a lot of our volunteers are linked to the university in some way, and the idea of just the gift of being around people who do have learning disabilities but kind of teach us another way of being and of living, and getting people out of their heads, and so it's very hard to pin down the essence of Lynn's House, but for me it was the community which showed me. For me, I often come back to the language of a lived expression of the gospel. There's just a way of being and a way of seeing, a way of really seeing God in everyone, and a real sense of human dignity and how that can be celebrated as a community, which is like, we need more of this. And then kind of, I've been visiting different.
How many people lived there?
The residential community is only 3 people, so it's 3 young adults who are either studying,
of which you were one.
Of which I was one, and people are either studying full time or working full time, or I've had 2 housemates who are like in between, kind of hearing back from things and just doing various bits and bobs of jobs. But we pay rent, but then the wider community, there are about maybe 12 core friends, so people with learning disabilities, maybe about a similar number of volunteers, 15 volunteers. And then overall the community is about 30 to 40, including kind of parents, wider friends of the community, trustees. So that was an interesting model of residential community feeding a wider community. And many communities do have these concentric circles of belonging, which is really interesting as well. And for me that can link to church, and that you can have a small residential community of 3 or 4 attached to a parish church, but that community can be a bit of a nucleus for things. I
Thank you. Very cool. A lot of rounding. No, really helpful.
Absolutely, really.
Did you have like a primary question when you set out on this journey, or a driver, or a?
The driver was just wanting to learn about different models of community. So the charity that I was working for, I don't formally work for them anymore, but I hope to come back to them. They have been there's been a prayerfully held vision around creating a new community. And so it was feeling very called to that vision, but not wanting to be only informed by my experience of Lynn's House, and wanting to learn about how other communities are doing things, as practically and financially as well. And so just wanting to see how different places do things, and thinking about these questions of sustainability, finances, structure, how they start, how they grow, how they struggle, and gaining a sense.
This might be too big a question, but are there some themes that you, or examples of, this is a terrible phrase, best practice, but sort of, can you share some wisdom on how to sustain communities, perhaps in the stage where things are perhaps, I don't know, the more struggly kind of stage?
I think for me the common thread of all the communities I visited was a genuine desire to be open to the Holy Spirit, or very much a desire to live out the gospel. And so that's always the core of the community, because I focused on Christian communities. There are loads of communities who aren't Christian communities, but that was my emphasis. And like speaking to the founders and people involved, or like the founding story of the community is to pursue the gospel, and to pursue the gospel fully and authentically. So I think that is probably the consistent thread. Where I felt that, interestingly, with the Bruderhof, I don't know whether people are familiar with the Bruderhof, but they're kind of like the Amish, they're Anabaptist, so and there I actually felt like their life is so cultural as well. It's like a cultural way of being that I did wonder whether the initial essence of the the origins of that community, which was about radical pursuit of the gospel, is maybe actually weaker than it was because people are entering into this culture and way of life, but maybe it's less rooted in the spiritual conviction than it was. And it's the oldest, it's over 100 years, so I wanted to visit that one as an example of a community which has lasted a long time and multiple generations.
How many people live in that community roughly?
Worldwide, I think it's 2,000, 3,000. The one I visited in the UK is about 300.
Oh wow.
Where are
So,
the Amish in the UK?
sorry?
Where are the Amish in the UK?
I don't know about the Amish, but the Bruderhof,
Those are
there's, they're both, there's one in the southeast, and I think the other one's not too far from there, they're both south.
Imagine only 2,000. I feel like they punch above their weight for like.
Yeah. And they're
I just
really.
assumed they were like loads in America or something. Like,
I think
wow.
it's 2003. I think I might be wrong though, but I think it's 2000, 3000. They have a really good publication called The Plough. If you're interested, it's a very, very good Christian publication.
Again, I can't believe that Plough comes from a community.
Yeah.
And did you hear threads about what people found hard in community? Were they similar?
No, I wish I could have dug deeper into that. There's an extent at which I was only staying an average of maybe 4 days with communities, 4 or 5 days. And so I think to dig into the very hard stuff, you need to have built relationship over a longer period of time. And I was often just talking to people in the time that they had, so they're receiving the very generous gift of their time for an hour, but not always managing to fit it all in. So people would give kind of the generic kind of community hardships of there are people that you don't get on with, or there are sacrifices to be made, as the generic things. Some communities do struggle with recruitment. The communities I visited are all very different, so it's beyond the generic community things that's harder to pin down. Scargill was interesting that they closed in 2009 and then reopened, so I was really interested about what happened there. And initially they had staff as part of the community, and when they reopened they decided to no longer have staffed positions and only stipended positions, and everyone from the director to people working in the kitchen are stipended at the same level. It's to do with how long you're staying rather than your role. But the no longer having staffed positions made it financially viable. But Iona do have staffed positions. So very practical things like that as well. And I think one lesson from the community in Birmingham was having some element of permanence in more transient communities. I think in urban communities they can be more transient because people are changing job or there's other places to move to. But they came up with a system of recognising that they could deal with the transients if they had a more permanent member. So Phil, you were saying here, kind of having yourself and Sarah as a more permanent placeholder and to hold the home, and so they have a similar system having anchor residents, and likewise at Love Bristol you've got leaders who hold certain permanence.
Would those leaders commit to a period of time then?
It's variable depending on what stage of life they're in. There's one couple that's been leading community for 22 years, whereas most of the others have only been doing it between 2 and 4 years.
Did you say it's about 12 houses that you're... Roughly how big were those? What scale are each of those?
The smallest one is 6 people, and the biggest one is 24 people. So I'm looking after about 110 people in community if we're completely full.
And what's your role in that?
I'm what they call a community houses pastor, so I'm responsible for recruitment, for checking in on people, for growing the leaders, checking in with leaders, making sure that they're okay. I'm available to anybody who wants to talk to me. So if there is something edgy going on in a house, they can come and talk to me. quite a lot of the time I find myself coaching the person rather than getting into the nitty-gritty, because if it's between two people, I will always direct them back to the person to sort it out with, and not just draw me into and blow it up. The biblical principles are going back to the person you've got the beef with, but it might be coaching them in, well, how could you communicate that better, or what kind of language could you use, or what's worrying you about taking that forward. It's more of a coaching thing. And for doing stuff like this and drawing people in the city together, it's a varied role. It's a lot of fun.
Sounds amazing.
And I get to go and have a different dinner every Monday night. I go around all of them. Every Monday I go to a different house, just in a rotation, so that I can. Part of my responsibility is to make sure that they're maintaining what defines them as a religious community. So I have to make sure that spiritually they're maintaining their health.
So Love Bristol is a charity. Is a charity or
Love Bristol, it's predominantly it's a charity, but it's a church, and under the umbrella of Love Bristol Church, we've got a cafe, 2 charity shops, community houses, the Ukraine project. We've got art spaces. For a small charity, we do quite a lot.
Yeah.
But it all comes under that umbrella of Love Bristol Church. And technically, I suppose, we grew out of Woodies as a pastorate, and then felt very much called to serve Stokes Croft, which is the area that we're in, which is quite an interesting area of the city. It's in the middle of being gentrified, but it's traditionally where there's been a lot of poverty, a lot of addiction, a lot of mental health issues. But it's changing. So yeah, it's a small charity, but it does quite a lot. It's about 3 minutes you came to our team meeting, didn't you?
Yeah.
You're constituted as a charity. Do you also have is the housing run as a community interest or a social enterprise or a for-profit? And then I was gonna are they all charities or
Yeah, the charity shops are all not for profit, and even the cafe, a lot of the money gets ploughed back into other projects. The community houses are slightly different. They're owned by various different people, so we caretake quite a few houses that belong to Anglican vicars. And it's like their pensions, but we manage them as community houses. Mm-hmm. We own some of them are owned by other trusts. But we're certainly, the only money we're making is to pay off the mortgages. And to do the maintenance, but we're not making money as such. It's not there to make money, it's there to provide spaces for people to live in community.
Yeah, the ownership question is one that I feel like who here the metaphor we use is the hardware and then the software, and the hardware is owned by the charity, and the software is we basically have freedom to run the moving parts in the life and that sort of thing. It's difficult to see. I don't have a lot of conviction that the charitable frame works for equity and growing old, etc. Somehow that the charity thing, you end up, you have to rent and you have to be kind of financially disinterested in terms of the asset. So I'd be interested in, without going full Bruderhof, how would we create something with the durability to age into?
Well, our age range is minus 9 months to 65. So people come in with no children, leave with several, but we also have the older end of the community. And I think that for me that's really important, because it takes a community to raise a child. So if you're looking at it from the point of view of a child, we've got this amazing community that is raising a child.
And people are allowed to grow old
Yeah.
in the Bristol community.
And I guess it also takes a community perhaps to as someone gets really frail perhaps, or sick, or...
Yeah, we haven't had that. We've had people who have been really sick. So we had somebody who had major brain surgery, whose character completely changed for a while.
Oh my goodness.
And we walked him through that journey. We do take recovering addicts. Once they've reached a certain stage in their journey, we'll take them and continue to grow them, we hope. Yeah, we have had people who have been really sick.
And just the fact that you're several houses and that you have a sort of someone who's overseeing them all, do you think that gives you the, I can't remember a better word than sort of this collective strength to walk alongside people with?
Yeah, I think so, and I think it's nice because as long as we're nurturing our leaders, the leaders are quite interested in doing things collaboratively with other houses. So I quite often hear, and it makes my heart sing, oh yeah, well, 54 went to 1B for dinner the other night and they did their community night together, and oh yeah, we just had an impromptu picnic on the mound, and you know they do all of that kind of stuff. And yes, they do. If there's a house that's struggling with something, you'll invariably find that another house has gone round to do something. So it's a proper network. It's not just lots of individual houses. It's they're working together.
Which is what's so exciting about Love Bristol. But going back to your question, Phil, that's one of the main things, is that because then after leaving Lynn's house, I just set up like a very informal community. But that only works because I was blessed with finding a house on Spare Room which was being rented as a house, and the landlord was willing to just hand it over to me even though I hadn't confirmed like the tenants, which is really rare. And now it is going on for a second year because like one person is staying and willing to carry on. But if you don't own property, it's basically impossible to, you're always thinking like, will it be able to go on an extra year? And so like I'm really interested about Church of England property because I know that they've got lots of it. And I know that the church and various convents and things are selling parts of their property. So I think for me there's a question of repurposing existing property which is going to get sold anyway. And I'm not like an architect or a social planner or whatever, but I'm like, people pay rent in these buildings. So like hopefully that can keep them kind of economically viable. But I think it does require ownership in some way of property to be able to start things more substantially. But that it is possible to create kind of low-key community for 1 or 2 years with a rented place. But I don't know, we've got kind of architects in the room.
We rent all of our Muller houses.
Okay, yeah.
And the houses that belong to the vicars, we effectively have a rental agreement with them.
Yeah.
But we know it's going to be, we re-sign them every 2 years, but we know that they're not.
There's a relationship there
There's a
which
relationship
enables
and
it.
it's going to continue.
Yeah. I guess I was thinking more in terms of a kind of individual trying to just find a house in London or Cambridge.
There's a group in Bath that tried to do it and it fizzled out because they had problems maintaining the tenancy and the name of the person on the tenancy.
Yeah. And I was wondering, given that there are architects in the room and like you've mentioned like a little research project around architecture and community and people have been thinking about it, I don't know enough to ask a good question, but I'm intrigued about what you've been exploring around kind of building architecture and community.
I don't know. Jen, do you have an executive summary of Once Within a Space?
I can talk about Once Within Space, but I'm not an
Yeah.
architect. I'm working with some architects, but I'm not.
And strictly speaking, I'm not an architect, lest the AI.
Oh, I got in trouble with that. I once put a
knocking
thing
on
with
the door.
a quote from a film, called him an architect, and he was like, no, you can't say that. Check the title. Yes, I'm not an architect. That feels like, beginning of an AA meeting saying, hi, I'm Jen, and I'm not an architect. But,
I've
so...
not been an architect. But
So, yes, the small charity I lead has one project within it, which is called Once Within a Space. So the film that I met you in, I met Lakshmi in a different context for a different project. But this project is just exploring all of this stuff, but it's exploring it specifically around what would a house design look like that could sustain 12 people through the full span of life with all of the changes, and including aging, disability, all of that kind of stuff within an urban environment. And it started off more abstract. It's slightly less abstract now because the architects we're working with are based in Brisbane in Australia, and they have a close relationship to Brisbane Council and are quite aware of the sort of housing stock of like council housing there, and that the fact that there is a mismatch between need and like the type of housing that's available. And so we're sort of starting to move the design and adapt the design for the idea of like, what if we were actually given a specific piece of land through them in Brisbane that has all the same kind of housing issues that you'd imagine, or that we have here in terms of like just the cost basically, and the difficulty of people staying in urban environments long term, because of either financial issues or growing families and all of that kind of stuff. So it's been through several iterations, and at the moment we're exploring a design for a Brisbane space, so I guess I'm really interested in how, like, what is the contribution that the actual design itself can make to facilitating these relationships, and I suppose I'm particularly interested in things like how do you manage when there is like quite a variance of ability, disability, or different stages of life and different rhythms of life, and also how and I don't have any answers to this, but just how architecture can facilitate can itself, the space itself, be a power balancing force. So how can it prevent individuals or any couple or any family having an unhealthy dominance in the space? But there's obviously like pastoral things in that, but what's the architectural role in that could contribute to that? So that's one of the things I'm kind of interested in. And in terms of like sustainability and climate stuff, I think it's more, obviously there's all of the questions around materials and stuff like that, but more focused on what is the way in which creating a space that can sustain people long term can itself be measured as in sustainability terms, in terms of preventing people having to always be uprooted and being able to commit to a community, and how can you actually measure that in terms of climate stuff as well,
and also
as well as
like relationally and kind of health wise, and
it's like you can look at all of these things in terms of contributions to indirectly to climate stuff as well.
Was why 12 people? Was there
I think it was just instinctively from my experience of living in a community of about 12 people, and just sort of feel like, I was having a conversation with you before, our community is far from perfect, but one of the things that does feel right about it is the number. And wow, Jesus, 12. That's a big number. And from my lived experience, it's felt like enough to be a stretch for people, enough to like properly break out of a nuclear without turning into something that could just be a little bit stop feeling like a home, I think, maybe, or like a household. I think just a number that can be stretching beyond nuclear but still feel like householdy. I think. But I'd be really interested to know about you guys' experience of like And well, you guys as well. Like, what is the is there an optimal number, and what is it?
Yeah, and it's interesting because I was talking to a friend about community, and he was saying that the optimal community size, I think he said 13, but like somewhere around there.
Okay.
And he mentioned that it was big enough to hold someone who's more vulnerable, which I thought was a really interesting comment, because if you're just 3 or 4, if you've got someone who's got a bit more needs, or that becomes very potentially difficult, whilst like kind of the 12 to 13 space meaning that you can hold more.
That's really interesting.
I'd corroborate that 12 seems like a sweet spot, and it's hard to exactly put your finger on it. There's plenty of seasons where we're less than, so we're 10 plus
and
a guest.
And it changes, yeah.
And when we're only 8 people, like we've spent, so we had a couple living here who moved out after 5 years, and like I think, I mean, it's another question of having 2 couples. I think is a good balance for another set of reasons. But just having 8 people felt more of a strain, less economies of scale, less critical mass, and yeah. But I would be interested in something more quantitative of like 9 out of 10 cats. Like how to, because I guess with like it's not 10 generic people, they are 10 unique people, and we haven't run that, like we're not a therapeutic community, we're not subsidised, we're not providing a service, so we haven't had very high needs people, and as much as it's cheap to live here, it's relatively expensive. Like it's so there is a barrier to entry. So to some extent, we're quite a narrow band of abilities. But I guess I do notice that some people have more overt dependencies or otherwise, and I could see that if we were a household of 4 or 6, just less ballast, less spread of like taking up the slack, or like
and for hosting guests. I mean,
And
we're
for
often
hosting
10
guests.
plus guests, and I guess it's about hosting people who are not residential.
Or even it was quite a powerful experience at the start of 2022 when everyone was sort of taking in turns to self-isolate for 10 days. Or like, sometimes it was two at a time, but it felt like we could quite effortlessly, meet people's needs with, 3 meals a day. It just felt there was very, there was a surplus of energy in hands, and it was quite easy to carry a few people for a few weeks, and that was quite cool to just see. It was almost a capacity I didn't know we had, without putting strain on anyone, it felt.
it was a really interesting revelation of like how easy it was to turn to that.
I'm going to do have thoughts on community size. So I've lived in community like residential of 3 and then like 4/5. I think 3 we were sustained by a wider community, and visiting different communities, I realise I do quite like it when it's smaller. So like I think more than 12 almost gets a bit too big. So I personally like the like family feel, or like the really intimate feel. So I think I'd find the 24 community, not for me, but like what's your experience of people and community size?
I think 12 is probably what I would consider optimum. And there's a whole load of psychology research about education, about numbers, and 12 is a good number, but then the next optimum number is 24.
Oh, how interesting.
Because then it naturally divides into 2 groups of 12, which is an optimum number.
Thank you very much.
Certainly the communities that are 5 or 6, I think they struggle because they're so intense, and it's much harder to hide in a community of that size. So if you do have anything, any difficulties, it's so much harder to exist in a community of that size. Whereas in 12, I think it's nice because it's just a good number of people, and there's a nice core that's always there, and consistent core stability. And 24, you do get stability, but it's easier to go and hide. So if you have somebody who suddenly finds themselves in a situation where they didn't know that they were going to get depressed, and they get really depressed, they can quite easily go downhill very quickly because they can go and hide in their room and it takes a little bit longer to be noticed in that scenario than if you're in a group of 12. In a group of 12 it would be picked up much more quickly, and that makes sense. So I think 12 is probably my optimum. I certainly notice the houses that are sort of between 10 and 12 work better.
Can I ask
And
what
have
mixes?
longevity.
Can I ask what mixes between single people, married people, families with kids? Is there? Have you noticed that there's a sort of like something gives a ballast or a different kind of stability or instability?
There's, the minute you have one or two couples in the house, there's just a different stability. It does depend on the age as well, and I think the minute you have people that are tipping over 30, then that brings a kind of stability as well. In the house where we've got the over 60s, it's just a different vibe again, and it just feels like family because you've got that breadth of age. I don't know. I love to think that the breadth of age brings something very special. But equally, I see communities thrive that are a narrow band of ages, so they might be sort of 23 to 32 or something, and they're great. They really thrive. So like 131 is really thriving at the moment. And they've just taken a couple in as well, so we've changed the dynamic again.
Do you find are most people that live in your communities Christians? Is that a kind of prerequisite? Is that?
Yes, they are, and ideally, yes, it is a prerequisite. But we take people that are on journeys. So if somebody's exploring and doesn't have a faith, then yeah, we'll take them. But we've also taken refugees, asylum seekers, whatever, Ukrainian families. We want to be hospitable, we want to welcome people. And we have quite a lot of people that are probably like here, we end up with a lot of guests coming. And there are friends of the community that are regular friends of the community. So one of the houses has a guy who struggled with addiction for a very long time, but he's been part of their community for a good 6-7 years, just regularly turning up for dinner. And that gives him a pivot point in the week, a stability point in the week. Well, there's a single mum with 2 kids for whom one of the houses has become a real safe haven, so the kids know that they can just turn up there and they'll be safe. They can go around there for meals, they can just be part of that community.
And did that happen organically?
So I think the biggest thing is about it all being relational. And we have taken people from other faiths as well, which I think it's important.
And what sort of kind of do people sort of sign a contract, or is there some kind of commitment that you expect of people?
Yeah, we have a thing. So the leaders of the house will hold the tenancy, and then from that tenancy there are licences issued. And the licence basically explains, I think I sent it to you, didn't I? Explains the vision and values of the house and expectations of the house. A few do's and don'ts, particularly around the boring things about decorating. Yes, you can decorate your room, but when you leave you restore it back to a neutral space. And just practicalities really. But we do expect things like eating in the house 4 to 5 meals a week, shared cooking, shared cleaning. We have like a home group once a week, a house night that everybody's expected to come to. And they're encouraged to join in wider community stuff. So we have a worship session in the morning once a week, and that's an open session for anybody to come to. In each house? In the church.
In the church.
And in in one of the houses, one of the lads runs a men's prayer morning, which anybody can go to from any of the other houses. So there's lots of crossover with different things.
Most of the people, or like, would a majority of the people in the houses attend the Love Bristol Church on a Sunday?
Not at the moment. I think my boss would say ideally yes. I quite like the eclectic mix of people because I think it sharpens people's faith. It brings questions to the table that you might not get otherwise. But the most important thing is people are building those relationships. People are bringing a depth into that house that spills out into the wider community. That's how I would see it.
And do people commit for a certain length of time? Or?
Minimum is a year.
I guess that's a commitment on both sides, is it?
Yeah. And there are very few occasions where I can think that's broken.
Can I ask an architectural question that anyone can answer? Obviously, you don't have to be an architect. But from your experiences, do you guys have any sense of like if you go from a nuclear family home, which is a lot of houses obviously built that way, to then try and do something bigger, let's say this number of 12 people, I know with you, when you're renting, you're just having to, like, well, even here, you've been given a house and then you just kind of make it work. I think you've got 2 kitchens, right? And I just wonder if you guys have any thoughts about, like, what is the optimal way you would set up for 12 people? Like, is it just you have the home, but there's just more rooms, and that's the only real difference, or maybe more bathrooms, but like the kitchen, dining, shared socialising space remains one, so that people are brought together and can't just sort of disappear and hide away completely, or that it maybe actually needs something that's different, like whether it's a series of studio apartments that have a, I don't know, like, but I'm just riffing, but like, does anyone have any reflections from their experience on how you would, what should be shared and what shouldn't be shared and all that kind of stuff?
It's interesting thinking about what you were saying. It was reminded me of the Broederhof and how what I really did appreciate about the Broederhof is their intergenerationality and their emphasis on care across all ages. So I'm like, having kids in this context feels like really doable in terms of like they're completely common purse. But from birth to aging, like everyone, like there's a place, and so a lot of, they've actually converted an old TB hospital into their community, but they've essentially created themselves a village. And so a lot of the houses like really wide corridors, so like electric wheelchairs are not a problem. The host family where I was at, there was like the kind of kitchen living area which belonged to the grandparents. There was also the like more or less adjacent kitchen living area of like their children parents and 2 young children. They did share a strip of kitchen because most community meals are done in this huge hall. But there was a sense of people living very close but separate, only by a door or by a curtain, and people live in extended family units, so like the 3 generations would live together but with that separation. Single people also allocated a like family unit to be a part of, but across the family unit they're probably reaching around the size of 12. And that, so like people could go to work but then easily go back to the house and wheel their elderly parents like tea and coffee or to dinner, and so that was kind of interesting to see like how told 3 generations. And my mum was also, we were having this conversation about care of the elderly. So my grandparents happen to live down the road from us in Durham, which is great, but there is a question of like when one of them goes, like what do we do then? Do they move into our family home which doesn't have a downstairs toilet and doesn't have a downstairs room, or like do we buy another house with an annex, which is really like, hard to get and is expensive. But apparently in Egypt, like families live in like houses of tiers, and so the elderly generation lives on the bottom, and then you've got like the middle generation and like the young generation, so they're all in the same house but on different floors.
That's really cool.
So that's kind of reflection as well.
Yeah, I wonder whether you might have insight on this, you guys, but whether it's important to have subspaces as well as you need a sort of coming together space perhaps for the communal meals, but maybe little corners or a second kitchen or a place where 2 or 3 people can just have a little chat, and it's. I wonder if that would facilitate a kind of bonding or a kind of intimacy that can be harder if there's 12 people around a table.
In our biggest house, we basically rescued that. It was a squat before we had it. It was on the national news when it was retrieved. Basically, the squatters had ruined this beautiful listed house. It's been to 1865 or whatever it was. So we had a free hand to be able to recreate it. But they literally, the squatters, before they left, they burnt through the floors. So we had to replace all of the floors. When they shut the squat down, they took out all of the sinks, toilets, baths, everything, and capped everything so that nobody could move back in. So we literally had it and had to rebuild it. And I just showed a couple of you the photographs just now. And it's a massive, massive kitchen dining room space, but the tables are great because it gets turned into a table tennis table quite a lot of the time. But there's a massive sitting room, but there's also the hugger room, which is a much smaller sort of Scandinavian-inspired room. So there is scope for different size groups of people to meet in different parts of the house. And we have one bedroom and bathroom that is on the ground floor that's accessible if anybody should need it. And for a long time we had somebody who was partially sighted who lived in the house, and it was great because he just could manage that level and know he was fine and know he was safe. So yeah, the environment is important, but most of our houses are just literally homes with big shared kitchens, kitchen dining rooms, space for a sitting room. Most of them, to be fair, have got gardens, so there's always the outdoor space. So yeah, but space is important.
I think there's something to be said about like a more accessible room, or like someone with limited mobility being close to the hearth of the home. And I remember being in Nepal and there was like this very elderly woman who could basically just be in the bed or just sat by the bed, but it was adjacent to like the main space. This was like just a rectangular small hut essentially, but it meant that she could slip out of bed, like help peel corn whilst the rest of the family were there, and then go back to bed, and it was just divided by a curtain, if that. And recently been walking alongside this man who sadly passed away yesterday, but we were going to visit him in the hospital, and it's kind of like if only he was like just in a home like next to you, and you didn't have to like go somewhere to visit, but someone could just be there and be part of a family in that process. But how our houses aren't designed for that at the moment. So I'm really interested by your question of how is it that we rebuild intergenerational homes?
Not so much intergenerational, but one of the things I love about 131 is when you go up to that first landing, there's a sofa on that first landing, and it's a really lovely, the number of deep and meaningful conversations I've had sat on that little sofa, it's been amazing, absolutely amazing. Or I've found in the time that I've been involved in community, we nickname it kettle pot ministry because you can go downstairs to make yourself a cup of tea. 3 hours later, still sat in the kitchen making a cup of tea. But it's that space to sit and just chat around the kettle or the sofa or whatever. Those spaces are important spaces.
I have a question, both how you guys do it here in this house, but also maybe elsewhere, with more and more people now transitioning to working from home. How is that managed? And especially in like shared bedrooms and what are the things you put in place? Are people working from home welcome to be part of a community like this?
Yes. We have lots of people that work from home, and I think we're lucky in that a lot of our bedrooms are quite big, so that they can have their little office space in one corner and not feel it's impinging on their sleeping space.
My whole community existence has been working from home, and I think it was possible because I was living in community, so I was doing morning prayer with people, and I'd leave the door to my room open, so like if anyone wanted to go to the kitchen they had to walk outside door. And so there's just a sense of just doing just a quick hello, or like, oh, Anna's also making a cup of tea, I'm going to make a cup of tea as well. And so for me it meant that I could work from home and stay sane. And it's nice because you do just have like a coffee moment.
Yeah, it has worked so far. I mean, I guess for the most part we've had enough people mixing it up, either working partly at home, partly not at home. We've got enough breakout spaces, but which is maybe back to this question, like enough spaces that people need to be on Zoom calls all day. There's enough of a space. Like during COVID, when everyone was working from home, we kind of set up like an office in the basement, like where we had lunch, like co-working. But I guess it is like an architectural question, really. Like I guess you would need. There'd be lots. I could imagine lots of scenarios, and I think lots of people found themselves in this situation in COVID, where it was like couples who lived in a studio flat or something, and then both people were suddenly working from home unexpectedly, and like couldn't do it, which would be hard. So having this kind of space, I think, is actually easier than for some people working from home. I don't know.
Linking the existing housing stock question to the working from home question, that this is a housing stock that there's lots of in England, but it's not what we're building now. And this would have had an extended family with servants, and somehow it feels like they iterated something that was relationally sustainable, that like you would be very high density living, but it somehow had buffer in it, and it worked for Tony for 20 years, 30 years, that it has space for introverts to retreat, it has space for kind of exuberant stuff to be happening downstairs, and I guess hard to do that outside of the kind of the, if you've got 12 people you can afford a bunch of buffer spaces. The same ratio of buffer spaces to private spaces is harder as you get to smaller numbers relatively. Before COVID, and I mean forever, it's been a predominance of 20-somethings, a predominance of part-time students and stuff. So there's like, and all of the rooms are 2 beds and 2 desks. Like they're generous rooms, but yeah. What am I thinking? Before COVID, we had various PhD students and stuff. We set aside intentional, exciting working from home days precisely to make an event of like the loneliness of working from home into something where we had a dining room and we'd have half a dozen people and we'd have a shared lunch, and there was a kind of novelty and intention and something to that. And then COVID, when it was all co-working all of the time, I think maybe that was like, it was its own unique mindset, but it worked. I don't know. We had more semi-permanent stations, whereas this space right now is a discussion space. When this stops, it becomes something else, and essentially it's neutralised back to something. So no one has a home office other than like their room. So where am I going with this?
Do you feel like there is one space here that is the kind of central gathering space? I'm just curious, particularly because you've got 2 kitchens. Like, how
I'd
does
say the upper kitchen.
the upper kitchen?
Mm-hmm.
The upstairs kitchen is probably the most like organic place where like the 3-hour conversations accidentally happen. So our downstairs kitchen is for cooking the communal meals.
Yeah.
And this kitchen is the like breakfast kitchen, like go and make a cup of tea kitchen, like do you. So this is definitely the more of the where the like everyday life is happening, and then downstairs is more the kind of the resource for meal, like the designated person who's cooking and doing their thing once a day.
I think I've heard you say it, Phil, but the not an original idea, but I think this house, like Spaceship, was really successful having lived here for like 18 months or so, and one of those is that interesting. You're talking about the degrees of like aging of the house, but I think for us, like degrees of privacy of the house, of you know the garden, the bike shed, the you know ground floor, the basement kitchen, lower ground kitchen, and kind of dining room, and the guest room is the kind of most. I guess that's where we receive people, and then as you go up the house, like you know, after lunch people might come up here, but then there's also the greenhouse and the terrace, which you know, fewer guests would come to than the roof, and it just sort of, and it was interesting talking about. I found interesting when I was living here. The majority of housemates would actually say that they were introverts, I think, and so then you know, finding ways to have different bandwidths and thresholds for people who want unlimited time with people, and I'm more on that end. And then people who, spaces where people can retreat and just kind of, I mean, one of the other great things about this house is there's you mark on the board whether you want to be in, out, keep or a tray. So whether you want to be in, like having a meal around a table, whether you're out, whether you want to come back in late and have something kept for you, or whether you just need like a bit of space and just want to take a plate to, you know, eat on your own and just, you know, that there's just space for that. And I think, again, like with the rhythms and also the spaces, kind of hardware and software, that there's just accommodation for that, because living together is, you know, you don't want it to be a pressure cooker, you need different like valves for that, and I think that's really nice.
Yeah, and a size of about like 10 to 12 means that you can have that in, out, because there's a certain redundancy. Whilst in a community of 3 or 5, as soon as someone's not there, it's like, is this a community meal anymore? Whereas if you've got 10, you're just expecting that about 2 people are always going to be out, but there's always,
There's still that decent number.
There is also something to be said like floors, because in both community houses I lived on the ground floor, which was close to like the kitchen, because I appreciated just being able to just have that quick hello, or just like being, someone's in the kitchen, I'll just say hi, and like just noticing the importance of like it actually does make a difference where you're living, and like because for me it would have been too segregated to be working from home and be like upstairs all day and potentially not see anyone, whilst being downstairs it was just the little interactions of like, Eli's heading out, like, bye Eli, or like, Gautam's come back, how was your exam? and just like that kind of thing. So,
the house is so sometimes when, with their full permission, when housemates were away, I'd go and like take a holiday in their room and like just to experience like what the house feels like from different perspectives. Totally different, because I was at the very top most of the time, and then if you go on the ground floor, or really interesting, like what you hear, what you are aware of, who you bump into. It was fun.
The gradient of public to private is one that I would commend, and then there's also like a cellularity of, the front doors are like people's rooms are their rooms, and they define the policy of how they do that, but the rooms are shared, and so there's a kind of mini community within that. And I guess more to the question of how does it work at larger scales, and thinking of like Windsor Hill Wood and other places I don't actually know what the fabric of Windsor Hill Wood is. It's a farmhouse.
So actually, they're about, I think at max capacity about 12, but the wardens live in this farmhouse, and they have this amazing room with this long wooden table which can seat about 12, and living space. They have like this one main communal space in the farmhouse, but the most people live in shepherd's huts outside around the central lawn, so you kind of feel like a village. and everyone's got their private like room, which is a little shepherd's hut with this one communal space. But what I did feel there is that it didn't have a buffer in between space. It was either like full on communal space or alone in your room, and I've kind of enjoyed hearing the emergence. Like it's really important to have that buffer, that in between buffer space.
I wonder how this house would be different if we had our own rooms. I mean, I know that wasn't really like by design. It was kind of just like what the architecture kind of, you know, sort of, you know, shepherded us into. But I mean, I love sharing a room, but it meant that your retreat is not to your room, which is it's a completely different dynamic. Because then if you want solitary reflection, alone time, you go to the greenhouse, or you can book the guest room if no one's there, and like, you know, take some time out there. But your room becomes something else. And I think even talking about like, you know, there are people in this house who face a, you know, full spectrum of mental health issues, but it means you don't lose someone in their room in the same way. And you know, for me, just sort of coexisting with someone is very powerful. And you know, that if you want, and I think because there are lots of nooks, if you need space, you can generally get it, but almost your room is something different.
Interesting.
That's fascinating, because of all our houses, unless people choose to share, then they're all individual individual rooms.
Which is, I mean, because like I think whenever you say share a room, people go, that is just radical. Most of the time in history it isn't, but it's kind of more radical what we've come up with in the 21st century. But it's hard to maybe propose to people, but I think what the fruit of it has been very beautiful here.
And would you find that like a sustainable way? Because I think I personally find it hard in the long run to share a room. Like I feel like I need creative space sometimes. I just really appreciate being able to like sit down alone and do some art or like music or whatever. And I'd find it hard to get that sharing a room.
I can only really speak for myself, and I think that I have my own room now and I don't like it as much. So. But people are different, so I'd be interested, to hear other people's reflections on that. But then
I'd be interested in this. Like, what was the room sharing ratios? Places in dorms, places in cells, places in self-contained household.
Everyone had their own room.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Because La Breathers are really interesting. You know, that's a big part of it, is sharing rooms with people, even sharing rooms with guests, it seems.
And it's interesting thinking that when visiting different communities, I felt like they had different like extroversion and introversion profiles. So the ones which were essentially hosting retreat centres, they felt like very extroverted communities. I mean, you could totally exist in one as an introvert, but I think naturally their rhythms and way of being was less conducive. So I probably like middle of the scale, but I would probably find it quite hard to be in those communities for a significant amount of time, because you're constantly eating with new people, like every single meal, and like working all day, and then like going to your room and out again. And then you've got the communities like Love Bristol, who just enable people to like live their life, and there is space to retreat and the acknowledgement that people are going to need different amounts of space. So it kind of feels like different communities hold different personalities sometimes. And I think the ideal is to create a community where you can hold the spectrum, and which I have seen. And And actually, interesting you talk about space. I just came back from Pilsden, and they have this huge manor house. So there's like tons of space, and they're about 20-ish. About 25-ish maybe as a community size. And that was really beautiful in that it hosted very different kinds of people. But for me, it felt potentially less like intimate in a family way. Whilst Windsor Hill Wood, which is about 12, felt like you were stepping into a family, which I really appreciated. And so I think it depends on the kind of feel of community. You can have it really big and be like, this is how we manage coexistence, or have it like deliberately a bit kind of more intimate.
And do you think to get that family feel, as well as numbers, there's something about a longevity? or perhaps it's to do with having some more permanent people and.
Or couples, I'd be really interested to hear what you feel like having two couples brings to this.
Just original.
Question to us.
I guess how do you, this sense of family that feels like it's quite successful, what seeds that, or what, is it permanence, is it, families within families, is it?
And personality, I think it's a tightrope to keep something structured without it descending into an institution, and people have varied experiences of family, plenty of toxic experiences of family, and there's reasons why people interact ambivalently with that, and so I don't know that family is necessarily the foreground metaphor I would I want people like sanctuary and like a space, but not necessarily the bind that I think good families should have. A good, we have a relational covenant, but I don't know, maybe it's my own issues on this, but I would probably bracket the degree to which I would advocate family as a language and family as a format. But we are a family, and then by extension, I think if you boundary this unit, then it's out of the overflow of that then people can kind of come into the culture that we set. And then to have two couples, I think, has also been a surprising key part of maybe counterbalancing the intensity, having some, first follower dynamics, and I don't know.
I don't really know how. I don't feel actually very well placed to answer. In terms of, I guess it'd be more for other people who've lived in this community to say what has that been like. But I guess it's interesting for you, if you've seen these different communities that have felt some fall a bit more on the family to institution spectrum, and what are the different dials that are turned that facilitate that.
Yeah, and it's true, the ones which tip on the institution level are the ones which are running the retreat centres, and they are very transient and have this operation to run, and they are generally bigger communities. I found it really interesting to hear what you're saying about family and throwing, I use that in a positive way, so that's the language that I used, but I guess I mean...
That's what I...
Yeah, but it's a really good point, and by family it's less to do with intergenerational or anything, it's more to do with the intimacy of relationship, I guess, and realising if someone's up and being there for each other in a particularly intimate way, which I think is mostly to do with size.
Labrie is an interesting... because I think I experienced various families, and it's almost like a federation of families, it's a kind of cluster of, and I think I don't know, that unit of 12 or something, but then you sort of make it more like a bunch of grapes, and you I don't know, or a Venn diagram, but there's something like that, family-ness.
But it is interesting to think in all of this about the language of family and also the language of friendship, because what do you call yourselves? And that has, I mean, certainly you'll know this from Lynn's house, that's one of the really problematic areas for people with learning disabilities, is that they often take language very, they understand things in a very straightforward way. So if you say that you're family, that means certain things, or if you say that you're friends, that means certain things. And but we can actually be quite liberal with these words in a way that can be quite harmful. So I think Yeah, I think that would be. I would have liked that to be one of the thought pieces that we could have done when we first moved in together. Would be around how do we actually? Because I actually think that I've got far fewer friends in our community than I initially thought. But I would have going into them like, oh yeah, we're all friends. We're just friends moving in together. That's all we are. And actually now I think through places like Lynn's house and learning, like getting to the learning disability, I'm starting to think about like how important it is to actually be really careful about the language used, but also careful to have an agreed language, even about how you're going to define yourselves.
And I can't remember who it is at the table that mentioned the whole aspect of living with essentially strangers. And for me, I think that's for me what the difference between family and friends is. Like friends kind of pick them, and generally your friends are similar to you in some way. And what I love about community living is that you're living alongside people who are like potentially just so different from you, and like, whoa, this is how this person thinks. Like this is this person's experience, and so there's a sense of like deep bonding and intimacy with someone so different to you, who you probably naturally wouldn't be friends with unless you lived with them. And that's my experience of the housemates I've had at Lynn's house, and for me they're all like brothers and sisters to me, because I've lived with them for a year. There's an intense community of 3, so I know them in ways I don't even know my friends, because you're living with people. But that's such a good point around language, and especially with kind of people with learning disabilities or other vulnerable groups of people.
Because your experience, Jen, is am I right, is it 2 couples with kids and then 2 other adults? Or what's your...
Yeah,
would you mind describing your community?
Yes, it's 3 houses on 1 block of land with 1 garden. The biggest house has a family of 5 with 2 lodgers, but they started off with just a baby, so that's been really interesting to see how the dynamics got affected by bringing in children. And then us in one of the little tiny houses, and then there's another tiny house that has is more like transient. So us and the couple with the 3 kids in the big house would be the stability families, and then they've got sort of rotating lodges, and then the house next door to the little one has rotating other families. Often what we have is, the most common thing is families who are renovating some house and need a stopover, and then we have them. And actually we found that actually works quite well to have, because we find that they bring in almost like a tacit critique, or that like feedback on things that we've become blind to, but at the same time we provide like something to even critique, like there is something of substance. So in this weird sort of like, no one's given up on the community, but we've given up on trying to define it. So it's a bit odd in that way, I'd say.
And so your 2 families bought the land together?
Yeah.
And you manage the whole like lodging situation?
Yeah, so we own our house. The next house that has renters come in is owned in a complex way between the couple that live here, their next door neighbours, and another friend. Okay. And they rent that. Okay. And then these guys own that house, and then the lodgers just pay rent to them.
Cool. Yeah. And so do you eat together, pray together, garden together?
So initially we tried to do a little bit of catch up, like crap, we've not had these conversations and now we've all got this property, let's try and do these things at the beginning of trying to flow in and out. But the main things that we do together are gardening. It's really very child-centred community now, so again that would be another difference. So because there's now, it's been fluctuating, but at the moment there's 5 children, and they actually really, in a sense, by accident, hold the community together. So it's them, we throw them in the garden so they can entertain each other and we don't have to really supervise them. And then they end up having problems. We have to go out, and that's actually how we're brought together. So it's, it's not exactly like something that you'd want to, that makes a really beautiful story about how we're all connected, but it is like, oh, someone's in a like tussle in the garden, let's go sort it out. Oh, and then I'll start chatting to the mum of that kid, so it's like, I don't know, it's an odd community, I would say.
I asked about like the success of communities, and I have repeatedly observed that like having the expectation set is really helpful. So I only visited more established communities, so when you join them, it's very clear, like, this is what you're signing up for. And it's like, okay, this is what they do, I'm signing up for that. And so when I set up this more informal community in Cambridge, there was a very clear, this is the ethos of the house, these are our shared rhythms, and I interview people to make sure that they're kind of fine with it, and that's kind of what you do for Love Bristol. And then it was interesting, I talked to Mim Skinner, who's got a book on that shelf, and she was also trying this kind of community between her family and 2 other families, and they bought this property and trying to make it as community living, which they ended up having to dissolve. But the interesting insight of, like, next time she would probably come up with the community vision first, then find the land or the property, rather than find the property first and then define the vision, which I thought was really
I would totally agree with that from the flip side of not having done that.
which is really interesting. It's fascinating, like, it's like we can't demolish all the homes and rebuild. So like when we have books around.
But honestly, even just things like, you know, they talk about the housing crisis in London, but like there's enough beds. Like it's a lot of it. It's not really housing. It's not a question of space. It's often a question of, you know, models of tax and, you know, policy, and there's enough space for everyone. It's just we're living more and more atomized lives. Like, you know, and so I think it's really interesting thinking about these questions in terms of, you know, just how do you encourage people to live life more closely alongside each other. Even the room sharing thing, because most people would say off the bat, oh no, I really need my own space, but it's like, there are other ways of living that we always think, oh no, I need to withdraw, retreat, but I don't know.
It is fascinating how it's gone round in circles, because the really posh bit of Bristol up the hill from where we are, Kingsdown, was all massive, great big Georgian houses that were owned by the merchants and the rich people, and they've all been divided up into studio flats, into bedsits, and Kingsdown has the highest referral rate to psychiatrists in Bristol, because everybody goes home, shuts the door, and they're not engaging with anything else beyond their front door. So that's where my question sort of comes in, is how do we as community houses go beyond our own front doors? You know, and how do we get the churches to go beyond their front doors?
And actually thinking about the sort of the buffer spaces of within a house are also important thing outside. If you're trying to reach a community sort of buffer space, like a joint gardening patch or a bench or a or even just the design of your front paths and stuff, something that makes you linger, and or a joint bike rack, or
we're known as the house with the massive teapots, because like whenever there's like street gardening, we you set up camp outs at the stall outside with the teapots, and no one else has infrastructure to cater for that. Serve tea to that many people, but we can do it effortlessly.
Because the Anglican church just up the hill from where we were talking, their garden is not a consecrated garden, so there's no burials there at all. So they literally have one half of the playgroup and the toddlers, and they have one half that's a more wild urban garden that's open to the public all the time, and it's the only nice green space in that area. And my husband said, I'm just nipping up to church yesterday morning. About 4 hours later he came back, because so many people were just out walking the dog, and there was even a cat walked in the garden. And you know, they've got a little stove thing outside that he's made out of bricks, and they had the little coffee pot going on the stove. And they ran out of coffee because he'd made so many pots of coffee. But to me that's what it's about. And how do we, you know, like you're gardening in your street with the teapots, that's great. It's exactly what we should be doing.
And it goes back to kind of the success of communities, is that they all have an outward focus. They all exist for more than themselves. And I think that's the key point. Even if it's just having an ethos of hospitality, because the house in Cambridge, you weren't like actively doing anything, but it had a very open attitude, and so people were in and out like this place does. And even just that is enough, I think, to keep a community together and give it life. I think that's what gives it life. It's like,
oh my goodness.
And I don't think there's one way of doing community. I think there are just so many different ways of doing community, and that's what's been really nice to see, is the different ways. So maybe like 12 works for intergenerational urban contexts, but I've also seen like bigger things work for different people. And so, yeah.
I don't know how everyone is for time.
I need to head to church in a minute.
Thank you so much for
thank you.
facilitating, hosting.
Yeah, well, all thanks to Phil, who just contacted me like, hey, do you want to come? Like, yeah, that would be great.
Yeah, you're brilliant at that, Phil. Like, it's really
thank you so
much.
much. Yeah.